Hello everyone, I'm Sebastian Y, and this is Foundations of Economics. In this video, we're going to introduce the concept of welfare economics and learn how to calculate consumer and producer surplus. Welfare economics is the study of how the outcome in a market affects the economic well-being of the participants in that market. When we talk about welfare, we're talking about how well off are the buyers and sellers in a market. The way that we measure economic welfare on the buyer side of the market is with consumer surplus. When we say surplus here, it's important to remember that this is a completely different concept from a surplus of goods as opposed to a shortage of goods, which we talked about earlier. Consumer surplus is derived from a consumer's willingness to pay and the price. Willingness to pay is the maximum price at which a particular consumer would choose to buy a good. We also call it the reservation price. If we know a consumer's willingness to pay, we can determine what their decision is going to be as far as buying or not buying a good. If the price of the good is below willingness to pay, then they're going to buy the good. If the price is greater than the willingness to pay, then they will not buy the good. In the last case, where the price is equal to the willingness to pay, then they are indifferent about buying. What this means is that they are equally happy buying or not buying the good. Willingness to pay has an important relationship with the demand curve. To show this, we're going to use our example demand curve that we've been using in the last few videos, which is quantity demanded equals 50 minus 5p. I'm going to use a blue line to draw in our demand curve. For details about exactly how to determine these intercepts, we've covered that in the supply and demand videos. Each point along the demand curve shows us the willingness to pay of the marginal buyer. The marginal buyer is the buyer who would stop buying if the price were to go up. For example, if the price were 7 and the price went up by a little bit, the person who is willing to pay exactly 7 is going to drop out of the market. We now have everything we need to calculate the consumer surplus. Mathematically, we're going to define that as the willingness to pay minus the price that was actually paid for the good. Think of this as the net benefit that a consumer is receiving from buying a good. Since they will only make the decision to buy if their willingness to pay is above the price, the consumer surplus cannot go below 0. This equation tells us the consumer surplus for an individual transaction. We know that in a market, there are going to be many transactions going on. Since the demand curve represents the willingness to pay of the consumers, we can show this distance on the graph. Let's suppose the market price is currently 5. I'm going to draw a horizontal line across at 5. If we plug 5 into our demand function, we know that the total quantity in the market is 25. It means 25 units are being purchased. We can use our graph to figure out this distance of willingness to pay minus price for each transaction that's happening in the market. For example, we can see willingness to pay of somebody minus the price is the distance between the demand curve and the price. For each point along the demand curve, we can continue drawing in these vertical lines from the demand curve down to the price. I could continue sitting here all day long and continue drawing these vertical lines until I have filled up the entire triangle. That is going to give us the consumer surplus for the entire market when the price is 5. It is the area above the price and below the demand curve. If our demand function is linear, which leads to a straight line demand curve, what we have is a triangle. We can use the formula for the area of a triangle to calculate the consumer surplus. The area of a triangle is base times height divided by 2. We can use this to calculate our consumer surplus. The base of the triangle is going to be this distance, which is our quantity of 25. Our height is this distance right here, which is 10 minus 5. And then we divide that whole thing by 2. We can do the top first. 10 minus 5 is 5. 5 times 25 is 125. Divide that by 2, which is going to come out to 62.5. Let's do one more example. Suppose now that the price drops to 4. This is going to give us a new quantity of 30. What happens to the consumer surplus? First, we can see that the 25 purchases that would have happened had the price still been 5, those are still happening. Except now, each of those transactions is generating even more consumer surplus than before because the price has dropped. So we can continue these lines all the way down to the new price, and we can see that more consumer surplus has been gained for those original 25 transactions. But since the price has dropped, the quantity has also increased by 5 from 25 to 30, and we're going to get more consumer surplus from those as well. We will again use the area of a triangle to calculate our consumer surplus. The base of the triangle is again the quantity, which is now 30. The height of the triangle is 10 minus 4. We're going to divide that by 2 since it's a triangle. 10 minus 4 is 6. 30 times 6 is 180. Divided by 2, which is 90. What we can see from this is when the price drops, the consumer surplus increases. Thinking about the area on the graph, both the base and the height of the triangle increase. On the other hand, if the price goes up, the consumer surplus is going to go down. What this means is that buyers as a group are better off when the price is lower, and they're worse off when the price is higher. Consumer surplus measures the economic well-being or welfare of the buyers. Next, we're going to think about economic well-being on the seller side. We're going to use producer surplus to measure that. But before we get into that, let's think about the seller's decision to sell. This comes down to the price that they can get for the good and the cost that it takes for them to supply that good. We can think about an individual seller's cost as their willingness to sell, the minimum price they would be willing to accept for a good. The seller's decision looks quite similar to the buyer's, but everything is flipped around. If the price of the good is greater than the cost, then they're going to sell. But if the price is less than the cost, then there's no reason to sell because they can't make money on that. And finally, if the price is equal to cost, then they are indifferent. Their outcome is going to be exactly the same if price equals cost because they exactly break even. We are going to use our sample supply function from the last few videos, QS equals -10 plus 5P, to illustrate the concept of producer surplus. I'm going to use a red line to graph this in. Just like with the demand curve, the supply curve shows the cost of the marginal seller. The marginal seller is the seller who would stop selling if the price were to decrease slightly. For example, let's suppose that the price is 5. 15 units are currently being sold, but if the price were to decrease slightly, then that number would go down. The marginal seller would drop out of the market. We calculate the producer surplus as price minus cost. Just like with consumer surplus, this can never be negative because no seller would choose to sell if their cost was greater than the price. This definition is again for an individual transaction. Supposing again that the price is 5, we can use vertical lines on the graph to show these individual producer surpluses. Here, 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 and so on. This again forms a triangle if we were to draw in more and more and more of these lines. The producer surplus in the entire market is going to be this whole triangle. We will again use the area of a triangle to calculate this. So in our example, producer surplus is base of 15, that's going to be our quantity, times a height of 5 minus 2. Divide that whole thing by 2. On the top we have 15 times 3, which is 45, and then divide that by 2 for an answer of 22.5. We'll do one more example. Suppose that the price decreases to 4. Draw this in right here. Our producer surplus has now shrunk to this smaller triangle right here. We can continue using our area of a triangle formula to calculate this. The base is now 10, and the height is now 4 minus 2, and we're going to divide that by 2 as usual. On the top we have 10 times 2, which is 20, divided by 2 is 10. What we can see here is that when the price goes down, producer surplus goes down, and when the price goes up, producer surplus goes up. This means producers are better off when the price is higher and worse off when the price is lower. We can see that if the price were to rise from 4 to 5, we would again get this increase in producer surplus for the existing transactions, but now additional transactions are happening. When the price falls from 5 to 4, we lose some transactions entirely, and the ones that do happen generate less producer surplus. Now that we've shown how to actually calculate a measure of economic welfare with the consumer and producer surplus, in the next video we're going to talk about how this all comes together in a market equilibrium.